Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1970s San Francisco, to a city painted in fog and liberation, to bathhouses with unmarked doors where men went to find what the daylight would not allow them. The Castro was transforming, the laws were loosening, and in the steam-filled rooms of the Sutro baths, the club baths, the Ritch Street baths, thousands of gay men were writing a chapter of history that polite society refused to acknowledge. They had no word for what they were building, a community born in towels and dim corridors, in the stolen hours between shifts, in the quiet understanding that here, finally, they could be seen. But they had each other, and tonight we say their names out loud, because they could not. I am Julian, and this is Gay Timeline, the channel that brings forgotten gay history back into the light, one quiet night at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. For most of history, these men were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be, a quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. Have you ever wondered what it was like to walk through an unmarked door and find an entire world waiting on the other side? Have you ever wondered what men whispered to each other in rooms where the straight world could not follow? What did safety feel like when it lasted only as long as the lock on the door? What did it mean to be visible in a place built for invisibility? Have you ever wondered who kept the towels folded? Who mopped the floors at dawn? Who remembered the names when the names were never supposed to be spoken aloud? What would you risk to be yourself for just one night? And when the night ended, what did you carry with you back into the daylight? Congratulations, you have just stepped off a streetcar at the corner of Castro and 18th Street in San Francisco, California, in the year 1975. You are holding a folded slip of paper with an address scrawled in blue ink. The air smells like eucalyptus and salt and the faint sweetness of marijuana drifting from an open window 3 stories up. You are about to walk into a bathhouse for the first time in your life. Let us see if you survive the experience. Good luck. The first thing you need to understand about the gay bathhouses of 1970s San Francisco is that they were not, technically, supposed to exist. California sodomy laws stayed on the books until 1976. Police raids were rare by this point, but not unheard of. The social stigma was everywhere. You could lose your job for being seen in the wrong neighborhood. You could lose your family for admitting the wrong feelings. And yet, on any given Friday night in 1975, you could find over 2,000 men moving through a network of bathhouses scattered across the city, like a secret subway system no straight person knew existed. The Castro was the heart of it. By 1975, the neighborhood had become the epicenter of gay life in America, maybe the world. Harvey Milk had not yet been elected supervisor. That would come in 1977. But he was already there, running his camera shop on Castro Street, becoming the unofficial mayor of a kingdom built on hope and defiance. The Elephant Walk Bar, the Twin Peaks Tavern with its revolutionary glass windows that let the world see gay men drinking inside. And tucked into the side streets, behind doors painted black or red or left unmarked entirely, the bathhouses. The club baths at 330 Grove Street, the Sutro baths perched on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, the 21st Street baths, the Ritch Street baths south of Market. Each one had its own reputation. Some were elegant, almost spa-like, with saunas and pools and juice bars, where men in towels sipped orange juice and pretended they were in ancient Rome. Others were grittier, darker, maze-like, rooms within rooms, corridors that twisted back on themselves, a geography designed for anonymity and encounter. You pay your entrance fee at the desk, $5 on a weeknight, $7 on weekends. The man behind the counter does not ask your name. He hands you a key on a rubber wristband, a white towel still warm from the dryer, and a small bar of soap wrapped in paper. The key unlocks a locker or a private room, depending on what you paid for. The towel is your only clothing from this point forward unless you choose to take it off entirely, which many men do. The soap is mostly symbolic. No one is here to get clean. You walk down a hallway painted dark red. The lighting is low, amber-toned, the kind that makes everyone look better, and every interaction feel like it is happening underwater. There is music playing. Disco, almost certainly. Donna Summer or Sylvester. But it is muted, turned down low enough that it becomes texture instead of noise. The bass vibrates through the floor. You feel it in your chest before you hear it in your ears. The first room you pass is the lounge. Couches covered in vinyl. A television playing an adult film with the sound off. A dozen men in towels, sprawled in postures of studied casualness, watching the screen or watching each other, or watching the door to see who walks in next. No one makes eye contact directly. Eye contact is a language here, and you are still learning the grammar. A glance held too long is an invitation. A glance broken too quickly is a rejection. A smile is a question. No smile is an answer. You keep walking. The hallway branches. One direction leads to the dry sauna, the other to the steam room. You choose steam. The steam room is the great equalizer. In the thick white fog that fills the tiled chamber, everyone is reduced to outline and shadow. You can barely see 3 feet in front of you. You sit on the wooden bench, feeling the heat soak into your skin, and within seconds, you are sweating. The towel around your waist feels absurd. You let it fall open. So does everyone else. Men move through the steam like ghosts. A hand brushes your shoulder. A body sits close, thigh pressing against yours. You do not see his face. You do not ask his name. In the bathhouse, names are optional. What matters is presence, touch, the shared understanding that everyone in this room has walked through the same unmarked door and made the same choice to be here. The historian Alan Berube spent years interviewing men who frequented the San Francisco bathhouses in this era, collecting oral histories before the AIDS crisis erased too many voices. One man told him, "The baths were the first place I ever felt free. Not happy, not always happy, but free. I could walk in and know that every single person in that building understood something about me that my own family would never understand. That was worth $5. That was worth everything." Berube's work is important because it captures what the bathhouses meant before they became symbols of plague and death in the 1980s. In 1975, they were symbols of life, of visibility, of a community learning to see itself. You leave the steam room. Your skin is pink, lungs full of eucalyptus-scented vapor. You wander deeper into the labyrinth. Every bathhouse has a different layout, but they all share certain features. Private rooms, some with doors that lock, others with curtains. A maze of narrow hallways where men lean in doorways waiting. A darker section, always a darker section, where the hallways have no lights at all, and the only rule is that you do not ask questions. The social architecture of the bathhouse is more complex than it first appears. There are hierarchies, unspoken but understood. The younger men draw more attention. The muscular men. The conventionally attractive by the standards of 1975, which skew heavily toward masculinity, toward the clone look that was becoming ubiquitous in the Castro, mustache, tight Levi's, flannel shirt, work boots. In the bathhouse, the uniform simplified to mustache and towel, but the aesthetic pressure remained. If you were older, you learned to navigate differently. If you were effeminate, you faced subtle exclusions even here, in a space theoretically built for all gay men. If you were a person of color, you faced worse. The Castro in the 1970s was overwhelmingly white, and the bathhouses reflected that demographic reality. Black and Latino men had their own spaces, their own networks, but they were fewer, and the racism of the gay community was not left at the bathhouse door. This is part of the history too. The liberation was real. The exclusions within that liberation were also real. You rent a room, 4 walls, a narrow bed, a hook for your towel. The door does not lock, but it closes. You lie down. The mattress is covered in vinyl, easy to clean. You stare at the ceiling and listen to the sounds filtering through the thin walls. Footsteps, murmured voices, the rhythmic creak of a bed frame in the next room over. Laughter, surprisingly. Someone telling a joke you cannot quite hear. The bathhouse is many things, but it is not silent. A man appears in your doorway, 30s maybe, dark hair. He does not say anything. He raises an eyebrow, a question. You nod, an answer. He steps inside. The door closes behind him. What happens next is private, but the fact that it happens at all is revolutionary. Consider the alternative. Consider the world outside the bathhouse. In 1975, gay men could not hold hands on most American streets without risking violence. They could not kiss in public. They could not dance together in most bars. They could not marry. They could not adopt children. They could not serve openly in the military. They could be fired from their jobs in most states simply for being gay. The psychiatric establishment had only declassified homosexuality as a mental illness 2 years earlier, in 1973, and even that delisting was controversial, opposed by a significant minority of psychiatrists who still believed gay people were sick and should be cured. In this context, the bathhouse was not frivolous, it was essential. It was a space where gay men could exist without translation, without code switching, without the exhausting vigilance required to survive in straight society. You could be legibly, visibly, unambiguously yourself. You could want what you wanted. You could find what you were looking for. And for a few hours, no one could tell you that you were wrong. The political theorist Michael Warner would later write about the role of public sex spaces in queer world-making. He argued that places like bathhouses were not just about sex, though they were absolutely about sex, but about creating alternative publics, countercultural spaces where different rules applied and different futures could be imagined. The bathhouse was a laboratory for freedom. You tested what it felt like to live without shame. And once you had felt it, even for a night, it became harder to accept the shame the daylight demanded. You stay in the bathhouse for 3 hours, maybe 4. Time moves differently here, slower and faster at once. You lose track. You move between the sauna and the steam room and the lounge. You meet a man who tells you his first name and the neighborhood where he grew up, and nothing else. You meet another who does not speak at all, communicating entirely through touch and glance. You meet a third who sits beside you in the lounge and talks for 20 minutes about his job as a librarian and how he wishes someone would write better gay novels because the ones he keeps finding are all tragic. I want a happy ending for once, he says. Just once. Is that too much to ask? You do not have an answer. In 1975, happy endings for gay men are still mostly theoretical. Around midnight, you decide to leave. You shower in the communal shower room, standing under a stream of water that never quite gets hot enough, washing off the eucalyptus and sweat and the faint smell of chlorine from the pool you never actually swam in. You towel dry. You return your towel to the desk. You get dressed in the locker room, pulling on your jeans and your t-shirt and your jacket, re-entering the persona you wear in the straight world. You step outside. The fog has rolled in thick, turning the streetlights into glowing smudges. You can barely see across the street. You walk toward the Castro, hands in your pockets, and past 3 other men walking in the opposite direction, toward the bathhouse. They do not acknowledge you. You do not acknowledge them. This is part of the code too. What happens in the bathhouse stays in the bathhouse, not because it is shameful, but because it is sacred. By the time you reach your apartment, it is nearly 1 a.m. You unlock the door, you brush your teeth. You lie down in your own bed, alone, and stare at the ceiling and think about the librarian who wanted a happy ending. You fall asleep still thinking about him. The gay bathhouses of 1970s San Francisco were never just one thing. They were community centers and sexual marketplaces and political acts of defiance and sites of profound loneliness all at once. To understand them, you have to hold all of these truths simultaneously. You have to resist the urge to simplify. There were at least 15 major bathhouses operating in San Francisco between 1970 and 1980. Some had been around since the 1950s, originally marketed as health clubs or athletic facilities to avoid obscenity laws. Others opened in the early 70s, specifically to serve the exploding gay population. The city's gay male population tripled during the 1970s. By 1980, approximately 1 in 5 adult men in San Francisco was gay. The bathhouses grew to meet the demand. The Sutro baths were the most famous, perched at Land's End, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The original Sutro baths had been a Victorian-era public swimming complex, opened in 1896, a massive glass-roofed palace with 7 pools and 500 private changing rooms. It burned down in 1966, leaving only ruins. But a new business opened nearby, adopting the name and the mystique. The new Sutro baths were smaller, grittier, but the location was unbeatable. You could stand on the deck, wrapped in a towel, and watch the sunset over the ocean. Inside, the labyrinth of rooms and corridors felt endless. Men joked that you could get lost in the Sutro baths for days. Some men probably did. The club baths on Grove Street near Alamo Square aimed for elegance, carpeted hallways, a juice bar serving actual fresh squeezed orange juice, a pool with underwater lighting, a sun deck on the roof. The club baths were where you went if you wanted the bathhouse experience to feel luxurious, aspirational. The clientele skewed slightly older, slightly wealthier. The entrance fee was higher, $10 on weekends. But the towels were thicker and the sauna had a window, and sometimes that mattered. The Ritch Street baths, south of Market, in an industrial neighborhood that had not yet gentrified, were the opposite. No frills, no pretense. A concrete-floored warehouse converted into a sexual free-for-all. The lighting was darker. The maze was tighter. The Ritch Street baths were where you went if you wanted intensity over ambience, if you wanted to be anonymous, even among the anonymous. Each bathhouse cultivated its own culture. Regulars had favorite spots. Some men visited the same bathhouse every Friday night for years, saw the same faces, developed friendships that never extended beyond the locker room. Other men rotated, sampling, seeking variety. The bathhouse circuit became a geography unto itself, a map of the city legible only to those who knew the code. The staff who ran these places were part of the community too. The desk clerks who checked you in and handed you your towel. The cleaners who mopped the floors and changed the sheets and scrubbed the steam room tiles at dawn. The maintenance workers who fixed the sauna heater and unclogged the drains and kept the whole operation running. Many were gay men themselves. Some were older men who had survived the pre-Stonewall era, who had watched the bathhouses evolve from furtive, raid-prone spaces into open, almost respectable businesses. They carried institutional memory. They remembered when you could be arrested just for walking through the door. One such man was Harold, who worked the front desk at the 21st Street Baths from 1972 until the bathhouse closed in 1984. In an oral history recorded in 1992, shortly before his death from AIDS-related complications, Harold said, "I saw everyone. Everyone came through those doors eventually. Lawyers, teachers, construction workers, priests. I saw men walk in terrified, first time, hands shaking. And I saw them come back a week later, a month later, more confident. I saw people fall in love. I saw people have their hearts broken. I saw the community build itself one $5 entry fee at a time." Harold remembered names even when names were not given. He remembered faces. He remembered the young man from Sacramento who came to the city every other weekend and always asked if Harold had seen his friend from last time. He remembered the drag queen who would arrive in full face and heels, change into a towel, and then reapply the makeup before leaving because she had a gig at the stud bar afterward. He remembered the man who proposed to his boyfriend in the lounge at 3 a.m, both of them in towels, and everyone in the room applauded even though marriage was still illegal and would remain illegal for decades. The bathhouses were witness to love as much as to sex. That is the part that gets forgotten. Yes, sex was the primary activity. No one disputes this. But sex and love are not opposites. And in a world that told gay men they were incapable of love, that they were only capable of lust and perversion and selfish hedonism, the bathhouses became places where men could discover otherwise. You could meet someone in the steam room and end up talking for hours in the lounge. You could exchange phone numbers written on damp scraps of paper. You could make plans to meet for coffee in the daylight, outside the bathhouse, in the real world. It happened all the time. The bathhouse was a filter, a sorting mechanism. It told you immediately whether physical attraction existed, and once that question was answered, you could focus on everything else. Some of the most significant relationships in gay San Francisco history started in bathhouses. Armistead Maupin, the author of Tales of the City, wrote about bathhouse culture with affection and honesty. His characters met in bathhouses. They had adventures in bathhouses. And readers recognized the truth of it because the truth was so common, it did not need to be exaggerated. Of course, not every encounter led to love. Most did not. Most encounters were exactly what they appeared to be. Brief, physical, transactional, in the sense that both parties got what they came for and then moved on. And that was fine too. The bathhouse did not demand emotional connection. It offered the possibility. That was enough. The sauna culture deserves its own attention. The dry sauna and the steam room were the most democratic spaces in the bathhouse. Everyone ended up there eventually, regardless of age or body type or social status. The heat stripped away pretense. You sat on the wooden benches, sweating, breathing in the eucalyptus or cedar scent, and you were just a body among bodies. Conversations happened in the sauna that would never happen anywhere else. Philosophical conversations, political conversations, men debating whether the gay liberation movement was moving too fast or too slow. Men arguing about whether assimilation into straight culture was the goal or the betrayal. Men discussing literature, art, music, the cultural production of the gay community that was exploding in the 70s, parallel to the sexual revolution. One man, interviewed by Alan Berube, recalled a conversation in the club bath sauna in 1976 about whether gay men should support the emerging feminist movement. Half the room thought yes, solidarity with all oppressed groups was essential. The other half thought no, feminism was hostile to male sexuality, and gay men would be thrown under the bus the moment it was politically convenient. The debate lasted an hour. No one changed anyone's mind, but the fact that it happened at all, a serious political debate between naked men in a sauna at midnight, captured something essential about the bathhouses. They were not just about escaping the world, they were about building a new one. The pools, where they existed, were mostly for display. The pool at the club baths was beautiful, lit from below, the water glowing turquoise in the dim room. But almost no one actually swam. You stood in the shallow end, water up to your waist, and talked. Or you sat on the edge, feet dangling, and watched. The pool was a stage. Everyone was performing. Private rooms were the inner sanctum. If the lounge was the public square and the steam room was the commons, the private rooms were where the bathhouse became personal. You could close the door. You could have a conversation. You could fall asleep afterward if you rented the room for the full night, which some men did. 8 hours, door locked, a refuge. The rooms were tiny, a single bed, barely wider than a cot, a hook on the wall, sometimes a mirror. The walls were thin enough that you heard everything happening in the adjacent rooms, which was either exciting or annoying depending on your mood. The vinyl mattress crinkled every time you moved. There was no romance in the aesthetics, but romance happened anyway, despite the setting or because of it. Men left notes for each other, tucked into the gap between the mattress and the wall. Looking for the guy in the Sutro steam room Tuesday night, red towel, said he worked in Oakland. I'm here every Thursday. Find me. The notes accumulated. Housekeeping would find them during deep cleans, dozens of scraps of paper, an archaeological record of longing. Some men became regulars in specific rooms. Room 12 at the 21st Street Baths had a reputation. It was slightly larger than the others, and it had a window, small, high up, but it let in actual daylight during the afternoon hours. Men requested it by number. Harold the desk clerk kept an informal list. If you wanted room 12, you arrived early and hoped. The social dynamics of the bathhouse were constantly negotiated. Rejection was common and had to be handled gracefully. If you propositioned someone and they were not interested, they would shake their head or say, "No thanks," or simply walk away. You accepted it and moved on. There was no room for resentment. Everyone was there for the same reason, and everyone was vulnerable in the same way. Mutual respect was the minimum required for the space to function. But respect did not always mean equality. The hierarchies were real. Masculine men had an easier time. White men had an easier time. Young men had an easier time. Older men, effeminate men, men of color, men with bodies that did not conform to the narrow aesthetic ideal. They had to work harder, settle for less, or create their own spaces. By the mid-1970s, some bathhouses began hosting special nights to address these exclusions. Bear nights for larger, hairier men. Older, younger nights. Men of color nights. These events were both inclusive and segregating. They acknowledged that the default bathhouse culture was not neutral, that it had preferences and prejudices that needed to be named and countered. The efforts were imperfect, but they happened. The music was always disco, always. Donna Summer's "Love to Love You Baby" was the unofficial bathhouse anthem, 17 minutes long, orgasmic moans layered over a pulsing beat, designed for exactly this environment. Sylvester's "You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real" was another staple. The music was never loud enough to overwhelm conversation, but always present, a sonic backdrop that signaled pleasure, liberation, the body as a site of joy rather than shame. Disco and gay culture were inseparable in the 70s. Disco was born in Black and Latino gay clubs in New York, and it spread to San Francisco as the anthem of a community learning to celebrate itself. The bathhouse DJs, and yes, some bathhouses had DJs, or at least someone curating the playlist, understood that music shaped the mood. Up-tempo tracks for the busy hours, slower grooves late at night when energy flagged. The music told you what kind of night it was going to be. The juice bars were an unexpected detail that surprised many first-time visitors. After the steam room or the sauna, you would find yourself desperately thirsty, and instead of water fountains, the bathhouses offered fresh juice, orange juice, grapefruit juice, sometimes pineapple. It was a small luxury, but it mattered. It transformed the experience from purely sexual to something more holistic. You were taking care of your body, nourishing it, not just using it. Some bathhouses had small cafes or snack counters. You could order a sandwich at midnight, sit in the lounge wrapped in your towel, and eat while watching the television or the parade of men moving through the space. The food was never good, but it was food. It kept you there longer. It turned the bathhouse into a destination, not just a stop. The bathhouses operated in a legal grey zone that everyone understood and no one wanted to examine too closely. Technically, California still had anti-sodomy laws on the books until January 1976, when the legislature finally repealed them. Until that moment, what happened in the bathhouses was illegal. But by the mid-1970s, police raids had become rare enough that they felt like historical artifacts from a meaner decade. This was not always true. The memory of police violence haunted the older men, who remembered the 1950s and early 60s. San Francisco police had raided gay bars and bathhouses routinely throughout that era, arresting dozens at a time, publishing names in the newspaper, destroying lives with bureaucratic efficiency. If you were arrested in a bathhouse raid, your employer found out. Your landlord found out. Your family found out. Men lost everything. The Black Cat Bar raids of 1961 had galvanized early resistance. The Compton's cafeteria riot in 1966, 3 years before Stonewall, saw transgender women and drag queens fighting back against police harassment in the Tenderloin. By the early 1970s, the political climate had shifted just enough that gay businesses could operate more openly. The bathhouses benefited from this shift. They were still discreet, still unmarked, but they were no longer raided every other month. Mayor George Moscone, elected in 1975, was quietly sympathetic to gay rights. He appointed Harvey Milk to the Board of Permit Appeals in 1976, the first openly gay city commissioner in San Francisco history. The city government was learning that the gay community represented political power and economic power. The bathhouses paid taxes. They employed people. They brought money into neighborhoods. As long as they stayed relatively discreet, City Hall was willing to look the other way. But discreet had limits. The bathhouses could not advertise openly. They relied on word of mouth, on guidebooks published by and for gay men, on the grapevine that connected every gay enclave in America. If you were visiting San Francisco from Des Moines or Atlanta or Boston, you asked around. Someone would tell you where to go. The network was invisible to outsiders and completely transparent to insiders. The guidebooks deserve mention. By the mid-1970s, several gay travel guides were being published and updated annually. Bob Dameron's address book was the most famous, a pocket-sized directory listing every gay bar, bathhouse, cruising spot, and friendly hotel in North America. The 1975 edition listed 14 bathhouses in San Francisco alone, each with a brief coded description. Popular with younger crowd. Older, discreet. Very busy weekends. The codes told you what you needed to know without saying anything actionable. These guidebooks were lifelines for gay men traveling in an era before the internet, before smartphones, before any easy way to find community in a strange city. You could arrive in San Francisco knowing no one, open Bob Dameron's guide, and within an hour be standing in a bathhouse surrounded by hundreds of men who understood exactly who you were. The guides were revolutionary in their mundane practicality. The outdoor cruising areas were the bathhouses' wild cousins. Buena Vista Park, Land's End, the dunes south of the city. These were free, open air, and far more dangerous, both legally and physically. You could be arrested for public indecency. You could be gay bashed by roaming groups of teenagers looking for easy targets. But they offered something the bathhouses could not. They were free, and they were outdoor spaces where sex happened under the stars, in the fog, in the tall grass, with the sound of the ocean in the background. Some men preferred the outdoor spaces precisely because they were riskier. The danger was part of the appeal. Others saw the outdoor cruising areas as shameful, primitive, the kind of behavior gay men should move beyond now that bathhouses offered safer alternatives. These debates played out in the pages of the Bay Area Reporter and the San Francisco Sentinel, the gay newspapers that covered community news with seriousness and snark in equal measure. Inside the bathhouses, the demographics told a story about who felt safe enough to be there. The Castro bathhouses were overwhelmingly white. The Tenderloin bathhouses, closer to the grittier part of downtown, had more racial diversity, but also more police scrutiny. Black gay men and Latino gay men often had their own networks, their own parties, their own spaces, where they did not have to navigate the casual racism of white gay men who would sleep with them, but not date them, fetishize them, but not see them. The novelist Samuel Delany wrote about this dynamic in his memoir, The Motion of Light in Water, which covered his time in New York in the 1960s, but applied just as clearly to San Francisco in the 70s. Delany, a black gay man, described the bathhouses as places of both liberation and exclusion. You could have sex across racial lines in the anonymous darkness, but the moment the lights came up, the hierarchies reasserted themselves. In San Francisco, the hierarchy was slightly more complicated because the city's gay community was more politically conscious. By 1975, gay liberation was not just about sex, it was about coalition building, about recognizing that the fight for gay rights intersected with fights against racism, sexism, capitalism, imperialism. The bathhouses were not insulated from these conversations. Men argued politics in the lounge, They debated strategy. They disagreed loudly and then had sex anyway because disagreement did not preclude desire. The women's bathhouses were a different world entirely. There were far fewer of them, maybe 2 or 3 in San Francisco in the mid-70s, and they operated on different principles. Lesbian spaces tended to emphasize community and conversation over anonymous sex. The social dynamics were less about cruising, more about creating a space where women could dance, talk, and yes, meet potential partners, but in a context that felt safer and more relational. This was not a moral judgment, just a recognition that men and women, gay or straight, tend to approach sexuality differently on average. The gay male bathhouses thrived on anonymity and volume. The lesbian spaces thrived on familiarity and trust. Both were valid responses to a homophobic society that wanted both groups to disappear. The economics of the bathhouses were straightforward. You paid an entry fee. That fee gave you access to the communal spaces: lounge, sauna, steam room, pool if there was one. If you wanted a private room, that was extra. If you wanted a locker instead of a room, that was cheaper. Some bathhouses offered memberships. Pay $50 up front and get discounted entry for a year. Regulars always bought memberships. It paid for itself after 10 visits. The business model worked because overhead was relatively low. You needed a building, towels, cleaning supplies, and staff. The customers brought everything else. There was no expensive inventory to manage. No liquor license to maintain, since most bathhouses did not serve alcohol. Too much regulatory risk. The profit margins were decent, and the demand was consistent. By 1977, the bathhouse industry in San Francisco was generating millions of dollars annually. This was a legitimate economic sector, employing hundreds of people, contributing to the tax base. City officials knew this. The bathhouses were part of the infrastructure that made the Castro a destination, that drew gay men from across the country to move to San Francisco permanently, swelling the population and the economy. But money and politics make strange neighbors. The same city officials who appreciated the tax revenue also had to navigate the moral panic that still surrounded gay sexuality. Anita Bryant's Save Our Children campaign launched in 1977, pushing back against gay rights ordinances across the country. The backlash was real. In that climate, defending bathhouses as legitimate businesses required more political courage than most officials possessed. Harvey Milk possessed that courage. In his speeches and his writing, Milk defended the bathhouses as part of gay culture, as spaces that should be protected rather than policed. He understood that respectability politics, trying to make gay men palatable to straight society by downplaying sexual freedom, was a losing game. Milk argued for full liberation, the right to love, the right to fuck, the right to gather in whatever spaces gay people chose to create. Not everyone in the gay community agreed with Milk. There was a conservative wing, men who wanted acceptance from straight society, who thought the bathhouses were embarrassing, who wished gay men would settle down, pair off, and mimic heterosexual respectability. These men usually did not say this out loud in the Castro, where sex positivity was the dominant ideology. But they wrote letters to the editor. They formed organizations with names like the Society for Individual Rights that emphasized assimilation. The tension between sexual liberation and respectability would define gay politics for the next 50 years. In the 1970s, liberation was winning. The bathhouses were the proof. The architecture of the bathhouses reflected their function. Hallways that twisted and doubled back created privacy through geometry. You turned a corner and lost track of where you had been. The maze was the point. You were supposed to get lost, to wander, to stumble into unexpected encounters. Lighting design was critical. Too bright and the space felt clinical, sterile. Too dark and it became unsafe, impossible to navigate. The best bathhouses found the balance. Dim amber light in the hallways, slightly brighter in the lounge, almost no light at all in the back corridors where the men who wanted total anonymity gathered. Some bathhouses installed red bulbs in the darker sections. Red light flattered every skin tone, hid imperfections, made everyone look better. It also signaled danger, transgression, the suspension of normal rules. When you walked into a red-lit corridor, you knew you were entering a different zone, where eye contact was unnecessary and consent was negotiated through touch and response rather than words. The smell of a bathhouse was impossible to forget. Chlorine from the pool, eucalyptus from the steam room, sweat, obviously, poppers, amyl nitrite inhalants that produced a brief head rush and were ubiquitous in gay spaces throughout the 70s. The sharp chemical smell of industrial cleaner used on the floors and walls. And underneath it all, the faint musk of bodies in close proximity, pheromones layered on pheromones, the scent of desire made tangible. The towels were always white, always. This was a practical choice. You could bleach white towels, sterilize them completely. But it became an aesthetic too. The uniformity of white towels made everyone equal, or at least gave the illusion of equality. A lawyer and a construction worker wore the same white towel. Status was temporarily erased. The most luxurious bathhouses provided robes as well as towels. A thick white terrycloth robe signaled that you were not actively cruising at the moment, that you were taking a break, heading to the juice bar or the lounge to rest. The robe was a costume change, a signal that shifted how others interacted with you. Footwear was rubber sandals or bare feet. Shoes were left in the lockers. The slap of wet sandals on tile floors became the soundtrack of the bathhouse, along with the hiss of steam and the distant throb of disco and the occasional creak of a mattress through a thin wall. Time slowed down in the bathhouses. 3 hours could feel like 30 minutes. You entered in daylight and emerged in darkness, disoriented, not entirely sure what day it was. The bathhouse existed outside normal time, in a pocket dimension where clocks were irrelevant and the only schedule that mattered was your own body's stamina. Some men stayed all night. The bathhouses that rented rooms by the 8-hour block catered to this. You could check in at 10 p.m., sleep a few hours, wake at 3 a.m., and wander the halls again, sleep another few hours, and leave at dawn. It was cheaper than a hotel and more interesting. The dawn exit was its own ritual. Stepping out of the bathhouse into the grey pre-sunrise light, hair still damp, skin still warm, and seeing the street cleaners hosing down the sidewalks and the early shift workers heading to BART, the collision of the nighttime world and the daytime world. You pulled your jacket tighter and walked home, invisible again. The all-nighters were the men who fascinated Harold, the front desk clerk. He watched them arrive, wound tight, and watched them leave 8 hours later, loose and calm. It was like watching someone shed a skin, he said in his oral history. They walked out different. Not permanently. Most of them would be wound tight again by Monday. But for that moment, they had let go of something. That was the gift the bathhouse gave. The gift was not always gentle. The bathhouses could be lonely places. You could be surrounded by 100 men and still feel completely alone. You could be rejected a dozen times in an hour. You could watch other men pair off while you sat by yourself in the lounge, towel wrapped tight, wondering what you were doing wrong. The emotional architecture of the bathhouse was as complex as the physical architecture. For every story of liberation and joy, there was a story of isolation and shame. Men who went to the bathhouse, hoping to feel connected, and instead felt more alienated than ever. Men who wanted romance but found only transaction. Men who left feeling worse than when they arrived. The gay journalist Randy Shilts, who would later write, and the band played on, the definitive account of the early AIDS crisis, was a regular at the Castro bathhouses in the late 70s. In his personal diaries, published posthumously, he wrote about the ambivalence. The baths are freedom and they are prison, he wrote in 1978. I go because I have nowhere else to go. I leave because I cannot stand to stay. And then I go back, because what else is there? Shilts captured something that the cheerleaders for sexual liberation sometimes missed. Not everyone experienced the bathhouses as purely liberating. For some men, especially men struggling with internalized homophobia, the bathhouses were a site of deep conflict. You wanted the sex. You wanted the connection. But you also felt ashamed of wanting it. The bathhouse did not resolve that shame. It just gave you a place to act on your desire anyway. The older men carried this ambivalence more heavily. If you had come of age in the 1950s, when homosexuality was classified as mental illness and treated with electroshock therapy, when gay men were imprisoned and chemically castrated, when every act of love was an act of crime, the sudden freedom of the 1970s bathhouse was overwhelming. You had spent decades hiding. You had internalized the message that you were sick, perverted, dangerous. And now, suddenly, you were standing in a room with 300 other men who were doing openly what you had done furtively for 40 years. Some older men thrived in this new world. They had survived the worst, and now they were reaping the rewards of the liberation movement they had helped build, however quietly. Others struggled. The psychic damage of decades of oppression did not evaporate just because the laws changed. The therapists who worked with gay men in the 1970s, and there were therapists, despite the recent declassification of homosexuality as illness, saw this ambivalence constantly. Their clients would describe the bathhouses with a mixture of exhilaration and despair. The therapists, if they were good, helped clients untangle the internalized shame from the legitimate emotional complexity. Yes, anonymous sex could be liberating. It could also be numbing, dissociating, a way to avoid intimacy rather than pursue it. None of this negated the political importance of the bathhouses, but it complicated the narrative. The bathhouses were not utopia. They were human spaces, messy and contradictory, full of liberation and loneliness in equal measure. The friendships formed in bathhouses were real and lasting. Men who met in the steam room and discovered they lived in the same neighborhood. Men who kept running into each other week after week until the coincidence became a pattern, and the pattern became a friendship. The bathhouse was a social space as much as a sexual one, and friendships could grow in that soil as easily as hookups. Some of these friendships were romantic, but non-sexual. You met someone, felt a spark, but the chemistry did not translate physically. So you became friends instead. You started meeting for coffee in the daylight. You went to movies together. You built a life together that had nothing to do with the bathhouse, except that the bathhouse was where you met. The chosen families of the Castro were built this way, piece by piece, connection by connection. The bathhouse was one node in a larger network of gay spaces: the bars, the community center, the bookstores, the gyms, the churches that welcomed gay parishioners. Together, these spaces created an ecosystem where gay men could live full lives, surrounded by people who understood them. This ecosystem was fragile. It depended on a critical mass of gay people living in close proximity. It depended on the city government tolerating, or at least not actively persecuting, gay businesses. It depended on enough economic security that men could afford the $5 entry fee, the rent in the Castro, the lifestyle that came with being openly gay. The economic barrier was real. If you were poor, the bathhouses were less accessible. $5 in 1975 was not nothing. It was an hour's wages for many workers. If you were scraping by, you could not afford to spend $5 on a bathhouse visit every weekend. The outdoor cruising areas were free, but they were also more dangerous. The class dynamics of gay liberation were always present, always shaping who had access to what spaces. The bathhouses that offered memberships were trying to address this, making frequent visits more affordable. But a $50 upfront cost was still a barrier. The bathhouses were, in practice, middle-class spaces. Working-class gay men and poor gay men had a harder time accessing them regularly. Race and class intersected in predictable ways. Black and Latino gay men were disproportionately working class, and therefore less likely to be regular bathhouse attendees. When they did attend, they faced the additional barrier of racial preference and racism within the gay community. The bathhouses were not exempt from the broader structures of inequality. They were pockets of freedom within a society built on hierarchy, and that hierarchy leaked in. By 1977, some activists were beginning to critique the bathhouse culture as too white, too middle class, too focused on a narrow aesthetic ideal. These critiques came from within the gay community, from men of color and working-class men who felt excluded even from supposedly liberated spaces. The conversations were uncomfortable. They forced the gay community to reckon with its own internal prejudices. The response was mixed. Some bathhouses started hosting specific nights for men of color. Others resisted, arguing that the solution was individual attitude change, not structural accommodation. The debates continued throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, never fully resolved. What did get resolved, at least temporarily, was the legal status of the bathhouses. The 1976 repeal of California's sodomy law removed the last official legal threat. The bathhouses were no longer operating in technical violation of the law. They were legitimate businesses. This mattered psychologically as much as legally. You could walk through the door without wondering if tonight was the night the police would raid. The sense of safety, relative safety, never total, allowed the bathhouses to flourish. By 1978, San Francisco had more bathhouses per capita than any city in the world. They were a defining feature of the gay community, as iconic as the rainbow flag or Harvey Milk's camera shop. Milk's assassination in November 1978, along with Mayor Moscone, sent shockwaves through the community. The bathhouses became spaces of mourning. Men gathered in the lounges and talked about what had happened, about the loss, about the fear that the backlash was coming. The White Night riots followed. Thousands of gay men and their allies marching on City Hall, smashing windows, setting police cars on fire, demanding justice. The bathhouses stayed open through all of it. They were constants, refugees, places where you could go when the world outside felt too hostile or too sad. In the days after Milk's death, attendance at the bathhouses dropped briefly, then surged. Men needed to be around other men who understood the grief. The late 1970s were the peak years for bathhouse culture. The fear of the 50s and 60s had receded. The AIDS crisis had not yet begun. Gay men were living in a golden window of sexual freedom, believing, reasonably, based on the evidence available, that the future would only get better. The bathhouses were where that optimism was most tangible. You walked in and saw hundreds of men living openly, joyfully, without apology. You saw bodies of every type, men of every age, all of them there for the same reason, all of them part of the same community. It felt like the beginning of something, not the end. The physical sensation of entering a bathhouse for the first time stayed with men for decades. The heat hit you first. Even before you reached the steam room or sauna, the ambient temperature was higher than outside, warmer than normal indoor spaces. The air felt thick, weighted with moisture and eucalyptus and anticipation. Your eyes adjusted slowly to the dim lighting. For the first 60 seconds you were half blind, shapes moving around you that you could not quite identify. Your other senses sharpened to compensate. You heard the murmur of voices, the hiss of steam, the thud of bass through the walls. You smelled chlorine and sweat and amyl nitrite. You felt the vinyl floor slightly tacky under your bare feet or sandals, the texture telling you this floor was cleaned constantly and still could not quite shed what happened here. The psychological crossing was steeper than the physical one. You were not just entering a building. You were entering a world where the rules were different, where you could be a version of yourself that the daylight world did not permit. Some men described it as stepping through a membrane, a border crossing between territories. Others described it as taking off a mask they had been wearing so long they forgot it was there. Michael Denny, who would later become a pioneering gay book editor at St. Martin's Press, was in his late 20s in San Francisco in the mid-1970s. He wrote about the bathhouses in essays that captured the intellectual and emotional texture of the era. The bathhouse was a school, he wrote in 1979. You learned your body was not shameful. You learned desire was not abnormal. You learned that hundreds, thousands of other men wanted exactly what you wanted. The curriculum was simple, but the lesson was revolutionary. Denny was one of the men who found genuine community in the bathhouses, not just sex. He made friends there. He met his first serious boyfriend there, a man named Paul who worked as a teacher in the Mission District. They met in the lounge at the Club Baths in 1974, started talking about a book they had both read, The Front Runner by Patricia Nell Warren, a gay love story that had become a bestseller, and ended up talking for 3 hours. They exchanged phone numbers. They went on a date. They stayed together for 2 years. When they broke up, Paul kept going to the Club Baths. Michael switched to the Sutro baths to avoid the awkwardness of running into an ex. This was common. The bathhouses were small worlds, and you navigated them the way you navigated any small town, aware of who you might encounter, avoiding certain rooms or certain nights if you knew your ex-boyfriend would be there. The etiquette of rejection was refined to an art form. If someone approached you and you were not interested, you said, "Not right now," or "I'm taking a break," or simply shook your head with a small smile. You never said anything cruel. Cruelty was bad for business, yours and everyone else's. The bathhouse functioned on mutual respect and the understanding that everyone there was vulnerable. But respect did not mean equality of desire. Some men were desired by almost everyone. Others had to work harder, approach more people, face more rejection. The man with the perfect body, the handsome face, the confident walk, he could stand still and men would come to him. The man who did not fit the narrow aesthetic ideal had to be more active, more assertive, more willing to risk rejection. This dynamic was visible in the lounge. The beautiful men reclined on the couches, watching, waiting. Everyone else circulated, moving through the space, making eye contact, gauging interest. The lounge was a theatre, and everyone was both audience and performer. The television in the lounge usually played pornography, though occasionally someone would switch it to a late-night talk show or a movie. The porn was background, visual wallpaper. No one really watched it. It was there to establish the mood, to make explicit what was implicit everywhere else. The films were always gay male porn. Heterosexual content would have felt like an intrusion, a reminder of the world outside. The porn actors of the 1970s became minor celebrities within the gay community. Men recognized them on the street, in bars, sometimes even in the bathhouses. Casey Donovan, Jack Wrangler, Al Parker. These men were famous in a way that was both specific and confined. Famous within the gay world, invisible outside it. Sometimes a porn actor would show up at a bathhouse and word would spread quickly. Casey Donovan is here. Men would drift toward whichever area he was in, hoping to catch a glimpse, hoping for an encounter. The porn stars were usually gracious about it, understanding that they occupied a particular role in the sexual imagination of the community. They were fantasy-made flesh, literally. The economic ecosystem around the bathhouses extended beyond the buildings themselves. The gay newspapers ran ads for the bathhouses, earning revenue that kept the papers afloat. The bathhouses employed not just desk clerks and cleaners, but also vendors, the companies that supplied towels, soap, cleaning products, condoms. The juice bars bought produce from local markets. The maintenance workers hired plumbers, electricians, carpenters. When you added it all up, the bathhouses were pumping significant money through the Castro economy. The critics, who wanted to shut them down, rarely acknowledged this. The bathhouses were not marginal or parasitic. They were central to the financial health of the neighborhood. The condom situation was complicated. In the 1970s, condoms were not yet standard practice in gay male sex. The AIDS crisis would change that forever, but in 1975, condoms were associated with pregnancy prevention, which was irrelevant to sex between men. Some bathhouses provided condoms for free at the front desk or in bowls in the lounge, but most men did not use them. The health risks men worried about in the 70s were treatable sexually transmitted infections, gonorrhea, syphilis, crabs. Antibiotics existed. You got tested regularly. You took your pills if you tested positive. You moved on. The calculus of risk felt manageable. The idea that sex could kill you was not yet part of the cultural consciousness. The only men who consistently used condoms were those who were deeply informed about public health, usually because they worked in healthcare themselves or had friends who did. The gay doctors and nurses who frequented the bathhouses sometimes tried to encourage condom use, handing them out, having quiet conversations in the lounge about safer practices. But it was an uphill battle. The dominant attitude was that condoms reduced pleasure, and the risks did not justify the trade-off. Hindsight makes this era look reckless, but risk assessment is always relative to available information. In 1975, the gay men in the bathhouses were making rational choices based on what they knew. They had no way of knowing what was coming. The poetry written about the bathhouses during this era is worth examining. Poets like Tom Gunn, who lived in San Francisco and frequented the bathhouses, wrote about them with tenderness and eroticism, and a kind of documentary precision. Gunn's poem, The Hug, is not explicitly about a bathhouse, but it captures the emotional texture, the warmth of unexpected intimacy, the comfort of touch, the way physical connection could momentarily solve loneliness. Gunn was part of a literary scene that included other gay writers who saw the bathhouses as worthy of serious artistic attention. Allen Ginsberg had written about gay sex and cruising since the 1950s, and by the 70s, his work was part of the canon. Robert Gluck, a San Francisco writer, would later write extensively about bathhouse culture in his novels and essays, treating it as both erotic and political, both personal and communal. The bathhouses appeared in fiction constantly, stories published in gay magazines, novels that circulated within the community, manuscripts that would not be published until years later. The bathhouse was a setting that every gay reader recognized, a shorthand for a particular kind of freedom and a particular kind of loneliness. But the bathhouse also appeared in straight media, almost always negatively. Newspaper articles about the Castro would mention the bathhouses in tones of disgust or prurient fascination. Television news segments would film the exterior of bathhouses, warning viewers about the promiscuity happening inside. The bathhouse became a symbol that straight society used to justify homophobia, proof that gay men were incapable of love, capable only of anonymous sex. This narrative was weaponized during the Anita Bryant campaign and the Briggs Initiative in 1978, which attempted to ban gay teachers from California schools. The opponents of gay rights pointed to the bathhouses as evidence that gay men were predatory, dangerous, incapable of stable relationships. They used the existence of the bathhouses to argue that homosexuality should not be accepted or normalized. The gay community pushed back hard. Activists argued that what consenting adults did in private spaces was their own business. They argued that bathhouses were no different from straight swingers clubs or heterosexual sex work, which somehow escaped the same moral panic. They argued that the bathhouses were community centers, not dens of disease, and that the attack on bathhouses was part of a broader attack on gay existence. Harvey Milk made this argument explicitly. In his speeches defending gay rights, he defended the bathhouses, not because he thought everyone should go to bathhouses, but because he understood that the right to sexual freedom was inseparable from the right to exist. If the state could regulate or ban bathhouses, it could regulate or ban any gay space. The bathhouse was the front line. The interior design of the bathhouses varied widely, but certain features recurred. Dim lighting, always. Vinyl surfaces, always. Narrow hallways, almost always. But beyond these basics, each bathhouse developed its own aesthetic. The Sutro baths leaned into the Victorian mystique of the original Sutro complex, with dark wood paneling and brass fixtures and an atmosphere that felt almost theatrical. You half expected actors in period costume to emerge from the steam. The club baths went modernist, clean lines, chrome accents, recessed lighting that could change colour. The designers were trying to make the space feel upscale, sophisticated, a place where successful gay men would feel comfortable. The effect was sometimes sterile, But many men appreciated the cleanliness, the sense that someone was paying attention to aesthetics. The grittier bathhouses did not bother with design. Concrete floors, industrial lighting, chain-link fencing separating the locker area from the rest of the space, like a storage facility. The aesthetic was brutalist, functional, almost defiant in its refusal to prettify what happened there. Each aesthetic attracted a different clientele. The men who wanted elegance went to the club baths. The men who wanted rawness went to Ritch Street. The men who wanted a bit of both went to the 21st Street baths, which split the difference. The staff who worked in these spaces developed their own subculture. Harold at the 21st Street baths was friendly with the desk clerks from other bathhouses. They knew each other by name, swapped stories, warned each other about problem customers. There was a network, invisible to patrons, that connected the workers across the bathhouse economy. The cleaners had the hardest job. They worked the dawn shift, arriving at 6 a.m. when the overnight guests were finally leaving, and they had 4 hours to clean the entire facility before it opened again at 10. The volume of laundry alone was staggering. Hundreds of towels every day, all of which had to be washed, dried, folded, and restocked. The cleaners saw everything: condom wrappers, empty poppers bottles, the occasional forgotten piece of clothing, the notes men left for each other. They cleaned rooms where bodily fluids had soaked through the vinyl into the mattress padding. They scrubbed the steam room tiles where mildew grew back within hours. They mopped floors that would be dirty again by noon. Most of the cleaners were Latino immigrants, men who spoke limited English and worked for cash under the table. They were not part of the gay community in the visible political sense. But they were part of the bathhouse ecosystem, essential to its operation. Without them, the bathhouses would have been unsanitary, unsustainable. The relationship between the cleaners and the patrons was minimal. A nod in the hallway. A quiet gracias when a patron returned a towel to the proper bin. The cleaners worked invisibly, as service workers so often do, unacknowledged until something went wrong. There was occasional tension. Some patrons were rude, dismissive, treating the cleaners as servants rather than employees. Others went out of their way to be courteous, recognizing that the cleaners were people doing a difficult job. The bathhouse compressed all of these class dynamics into a single space. The wealthy lawyer and the undocumented cleaner sharing the same hallways, existing in the same building but in completely different worlds. The music shifted as the night progressed. Early evening, when men arrived after work, the music was upbeat, energizing. Diana Ross, The Village People, Gloria Gaynor. The disco hits that everyone knew, that signaled you were entering a space of pleasure and release. By midnight, the music slowed slightly. Still disco, still danceable, but the tempo dropped. The mood softened. You were settling in now, no longer rushing. By 3 a.m., the music became almost ambient. Fewer lyrics, more instrumental tracks, the kind of soundscape that let you drift. The late-night crowd was either exhausted or high or both, and the music accommodated the shift. Some bathhouses had live DJs on weekend nights, men who understood how to read the energy of the room and adjust the playlist accordingly. The best DJs were minor celebrities, men whose names you knew even if you never saw their faces. Tony is DJing tonight at the club baths was enough to draw a crowd. The vinyl records used in the bathhouses became collector's items decades later. Obscure disco 12 inches that were only ever played in gay clubs and bathhouses. Tracks that never charted but were beloved within the community. DJs traded these records, built reputations on their collections, on their ability to find the deep cuts that no one else had. The poppers deserve a longer examination. Amyl nitrite, sold in small glass bottles with labels like Rush, or Hardware, or Locker Room, were everywhere in the bathhouses by the mid-1970s. You inhaled the vapor and felt an immediate head rush, a dizzying warmth that intensified physical sensation and lowered inhibition. Poppers were legal, sold openly in head shops and gay bookstores. They were marketed as room deodorizer or liquid incense to skirt regulations, but everyone knew what they were for. The effects lasted maybe 90 seconds. You inhaled, you felt the rush, and then it faded. So you inhaled again. Some men loved poppers. They felt the chemical rush enhanced the experience, made sex more intense, broke through the last layer of self-consciousness. Other men hated them, the headache that followed, the dizziness that could tip into nausea, the sense that you were chasing a high that never quite delivered what it promised. The smell of poppers was ubiquitous in the bathhouses, sharp, chemical, slightly sweet. You could walk down a hallway and know which rooms had men using poppers by the scent bleeding under the door. The smell became so associated with gay sex that it functioned as a kind of olfactory shorthand. If you smelled poppers, you knew what was happening nearby. The health effects of poppers were debated even then. Some doctors warned that regular use could damage your cardiovascular system. Others argued the risk was minimal, less dangerous than alcohol or cigarettes, and that the moral panic around poppers was just another way to stigmatize gay sexuality. By the late 1970s, the gay press was running articles debating poppers, interviewing doctors, publishing anecdotes from users. The community was trying to self-regulate, to figure out what level of risk was acceptable. There was no consensus. What was clear was that poppers were part of the bathhouse experience for a large percentage of men. They were as common as towels, as expected as disco. The bathhouse owners did not sell them. That would have been legally risky. But they did not ban them either. The unofficial policy was don't ask, don't tell. The private rooms, where they existed, were the most intimate spaces in the bathhouse. Not intimate in the romantic sense, though romance sometimes happened, but intimate in the sense that they were enclosed, bounded, separate from the circulation and performance of the public areas. When you rented a room, you got a key or a room number. You walked down the hallway, found your door, and stepped inside. The room was tiny, 6 feet by 8 feet maybe. A bed, a hook, sometimes a shelf. The walls were thin enough that you heard the room next door, but the door gave you the illusion of privacy. Some men rented rooms and left the door open, an invitation for anyone to walk in. Others closed the door and stayed inside, using the room as a retreat, a place to rest between circuits through the bathhouse. Still others left the door slightly ajar, a signal that you were open to visitors, but not advertising. The politics of the open door were complex. An open door was welcoming, but it also meant you had less control over who entered. You could be lying on the bed and 3 men could walk in within 5 minutes, each one evaluating whether you were what they were looking for, each one potentially walking back out. The rejection was more visible, more immediate. A closed door meant privacy, but also isolation. You could miss opportunities. You could spend hours in your room waiting for someone to knock, listening to the sounds of other men connecting, and no one would know you were there. The experienced bathhouse goers learned to modulate. Door open for 20 minutes, then closed for a break. Door cracked an inch, enough to see out, but not enough to invite the casual browser. The door became a language, a way of communicating your availability without words. The beds themselves were narrow, designed for 1 person or 2 people who did not mind being very close. The vinyl covering was practical, but unromantic. It crinkled. It stuck to sweaty skin. It was cold when you first lay down, and then quickly warmed to body temperature. Some men brought their own sheets or towels to spread over the vinyl, trying to make the space feel more human. Others did not bother. The vinyl was honest. It told you exactly where you were and what was expected. The rooms were cleaned between guests, but not perfectly. The cleaners sprayed disinfectant, wiped down the vinyl, checked for forgotten belongings. But the deep clean happened only once a week. In between, you were lying on a mattress where dozens of other men had lain. This bothered some people more than others. The walls of the rooms were usually painted dark colours: maroon, navy, charcoal. Dark paint hid scuffs and stains. It also made the small space feel even smaller, more enclosed, more like a cocoon. Some men wrote on the walls: graffiti, phone numbers, fragments of poetry, dirty propositions. The bathhouse owners painted over it periodically, but it always came back. The walls were a palimpsest, layers of desire and loneliness and humor stacked on top of each other. The most common graffiti was simple: names, dates, brief messages. Tony was here, June 1975. Looking for the guy from Saturday Night, Blonde Room 8. This place saved my life. The sentimentality was surprising in a space supposedly dedicated to anonymous sex. But the sentimentality was real. The mirrors were everywhere. Bathhouses installed mirrors in strategic locations. The locker room, obviously, but also along hallways, in the lounge, sometimes on the ceiling above beds, in the more elaborate establishments. The mirrors served multiple functions. Practical first. You needed to check your appearance, make sure your towel was secure, assess yourself before circulating. But the mirrors also created visual multiplication, making spaces feel larger, creating angles and perspectives that suggested more people, more activity, more possibility than actually existed. The mirror was also confrontation. You saw yourself among other men, saw your body in comparison, saw yourself as others saw you. For men who struggled with body image, and in a community increasingly defined by rigid aesthetic standards, that was most men, the mirrors could be brutal. You saw your stomach, your thinning hair, your aging face reflected back in amber light next to younger, fitter bodies. The mirror did not lie, but it also did not comfort. Some men avoided mirrors entirely. They navigated the bathhouse with eyes forward, never glancing at their reflection, moving through the space as if they were invisible. Others checked constantly, adjusting their towel, fixing their hair, performing maintenance on the image they were projecting. The locker room mirrors were the most unforgiving. Bright fluorescent light, full-length reflection, no amber filter to soften the truth. You got dressed or undressed in front of the mirror and saw everything. The locker room was where insecurity lived. Men changed quickly, wrapping the towel around themselves while still partially clothed, unwilling to be fully naked, even in a space dedicated to nakedness. The body standards of the 1970s Castro were not as extreme as they would become in the 80s and 90s, but they were present. The clone look, muscular, hairy chest, mustache, masculine affect, was the dominant aesthetic. If you fit that mold, you had easier access to desire. If you did not, you had to compensate with personality, persistence, or willingness to pursue men outside the mainstream. Older men faced the steepest climb. The Castro worshipped youth, and the bathhouses reflected that worship. A man in his 20s could walk into any bathhouse and find interest immediately. A man in his 50s had to work harder, face more rejection, accept that he was outside the primary market. This created hierarchies within hierarchies. The young, fit, conventionally attractive men at the top. Below them, men who were attractive but not quite perfect, good-looking enough to succeed but not effortlessly. Below them, older men, heavier men, less conventionally attractive men, who still participated but understood they were playing a different game with different rules. At the bottom, almost invisible, were the men who did not fit any category the bathhouse culture recognized. Effeminate men in an aggressively masculine space. Very old men in a youth-obsessed environment. Men whose bodies or faces or mannerisms marked them as undesirable by the narrow standards of the time. Some of these men stopped coming. They found other spaces, other networks, or they retreated into isolation. Others kept coming, persistent or desperate, or simply hoping that tonight would be different. The bathhouses were more inclusive than most gay spaces. At least in theory, everyone was welcome. But inclusion did not guarantee desire. The ethnographic work done on bathhouse culture in the 1970s is limited but valuable. A few sociologists and anthropologists gained access to study these spaces before the AIDS crisis shut them down. They documented the social structures, the hierarchies, the rituals of approach and rejection. One study conducted in 1977 by a graduate student at UC Berkeley. His name was Martin Levine, and he would die of AIDS in 1993. Tracked patterns of interaction over multiple visits to San Francisco bathhouses. Levine noted that most men circulated through the bathhouse in predictable patterns, making a loop through the hallways, the steam room, the lounge, the hallways again, in cycles that repeated every 20 to 30 minutes. He noted that eye contact rarely lasted longer than 3 seconds before one party looked away. He noted that verbal communication was minimal. Most interactions began and often ended without words. He noted the role of age, race, and body type in determining who approached whom, and the consistency of those patterns across different bathhouses and different nights. Levine's work was published in academic journals that almost no one in the gay community read, but it captured something true about the bathhouse experience. The rituals were not random. They were structured, learned, reproduced across thousands of individual encounters. The academic framing sometimes missed the emotional reality. Levine could document the patterns, but he could not quite capture what it felt like to be inside those patterns. The hope and fear, the vulnerability, the small kindnesses and casual cruelties that defined each interaction. The small kindnesses mattered. A man who smiled at you in the hallway, even when he was not interested, just to acknowledge your presence. A man who struck up a conversation in the lounge when you were sitting alone, not because he wanted sex, but because he recognized loneliness when he saw it. A man who held the steam room door open for you, a tiny gesture of courtesy in a space where courtesy was optional. The bathhouse could be a generous space. Men shared poppers, shared information about which rooms were best, shared warnings about men who were aggressive or disrespectful. There was a sense, among many patrons, that they were all in this together, that the bathhouse functioned best when everyone looked out for each other. But the bathhouse could also be cruel. Men who laughed at other men's bodies. Men who made a show of rejecting someone, loudly, publicly, to establish their own status. Men who treated the staff with contempt. Men who took what they wanted and gave nothing back, not even basic respect. The cruelty was never the majority experience, but it was common enough that most men encountered it eventually. You learned to develop thick skin, or you stopped coming. The regulars at each bathhouse formed an unofficial community. They recognized each other week after week, learned names or nicknames, developed reputations. There was the man who always sat in the same corner of the lounge reading the Bay Area Reporter. There was the man who spent most of his time in the steam room, sitting in the same spot, a fixture. There was the man everyone called Silver Fox, an older gentleman with grey hair and impeccable manners who had been coming to the club bath since 1968. Silver Fox, his real name was Edward, though few people knew it, was interviewed by Alan Baruba in 1983 as part of the Oral History Project. Edward was 62 at the time of the interview, which meant he had been in his mid-40s when the bathhouse culture exploded in the 70s. "I thought my life was over," Edward said. "I had been married, closeted, living a lie for 20 years. I got divorced in 1970. I was 45 years old. I thought, well, at least I can live honestly now, even if I live alone. And then a friend took me to the baths, and I realized I was not alone. I was surrounded by men like me. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. At 45, I started my life over." Edward became a regular at the club baths. He came every Saturday night for 12 years. He was well known, well liked, a man who bought drinks for younger men at the juice bar and offered advice when asked and never complained about rejection. He was gracious, which was not a word commonly associated with bathhouse culture, but which applied to Edward perfectly. Men like Edward carried the institutional memory of the bathhouses. They remembered when police raids were common. They remembered the fear. They remembered when the baths first started opening their doors wide, when the culture shifted from furtive to celebratory. They were witnesses to history, even if they did not think of themselves that way. The younger men who came to the bathhouses in the mid to late 70s were living in a different world than men like Edward had known. For the younger generation, gay liberation was not a distant hope. It was reality. They had grown up in a world where Stonewall had already happened, where gay pride parades were annual events, where Harvey Milk was an elected official. This generational divide shaped bathhouse culture in subtle ways. The older men were grateful for the space, treated it almost reverently. The younger men took it for granted, assumed it would always be there, complained about the towels or the music or the entry fee, as if these were the only concerns that mattered. The older men sometimes resented the younger men's entitlement. The younger men sometimes dismissed the older men as sad, clinging to a space they should have outgrown. These tensions rarely erupted into open conflict, but they simmered. The intergenerational relationships that did form, older men and younger men who connected across the age gap, were complicated. Sometimes they were genuinely mutual, based on attraction and compatibility. Other times they were transactional, the older man offering money or gifts or access, the younger man offering youth and beauty in return. The bathhouse did not police these dynamics. What happened between consenting adults was their business. But the power imbalances were real, and they sometimes resulted in exploitation. Young men, especially those new to the city or struggling financially, could find themselves in situations where they felt pressured to accept attention from older, wealthier men they were not genuinely attracted to. The community conversations about power and consent were less developed in the 70s than they would become later. The default assumption was that if you were in the bathhouse, you were fair game. The idea that consent could be coerced, that economic pressure could undermine genuine choice, was not widely discussed. The few voices raising these concerns, gay activists influenced by feminism, who argued that the bathhouse culture replicated patriarchal power dynamics, were often dismissed as puritanical or sex-negative. The dominant ideology was pro-sex, anti-shame, and suspicious of any critique that sounded like respectability politics. The feminist critiques of bathhouse culture came primarily from lesbian activists who saw parallels between gay male sexual culture and straight male sexual culture. They argued that the emphasis on youth, beauty, and physical perfection, the commodification of bodies, the anonymity that precluded emotional connection, all of this was patriarchal, not liberatory. These critiques were published in lesbian feminist newspapers and journals that circulated in the Castro, but were not widely read by gay men. When gay men did encounter these arguments, the response was usually defensive. The bathhouses were ours, hard-won, essential to our liberation. Attacking them felt like attacking the community itself. The divide between lesbian feminism and gay male sexual liberation would widen throughout the late 70s and into the 80s, exacerbated by the AIDS crisis. But in the mid-70s, the divide was already visible in debates about the bathhouses. The one thing almost everyone agreed on, across political divides, was that the bathhouses were better than the alternatives. Before the bathhouses existed or became accessible, gay men had cruised in parks, public restrooms, alleyways, spaces that were dangerous, unsanitary, and deeply undignified. The bathhouse was an improvement by any measure. It was indoors, relatively safe, and designed for the purpose. Whatever its flaws, it was better than hiding in a bathroom stall. The architecture of shame and the architecture of liberation were sometimes difficult to distinguish. The bathhouse was both. It was a space designed for an activity that society condemned, which meant it had to hide behind unmarked doors and dim lighting. But it was also a space where gay men could be visible to each other, where shame could be temporarily set aside. The spatial theorist George Chauncey, in his book Gay New York, argued that gay spaces have always existed in a tension between concealment and visibility. The bathhouse was a perfect example. Concealed from the straight world, visible within the gay world. The unmarked door protected the space from outside scrutiny, but once you crossed the threshold, you were in a world where homosexuality was the norm, where everyone understood and shared the experience. This dual nature, hidden and open, secret and communal, defined the emotional texture of the bathhouse. You felt free inside, but you were always aware that the freedom was conditional, bounded by the walls of the building. Step outside, and the rules changed again. The transition from inside to outside was jarring. You spent hours in the warm, dim, insulated world of the bathhouse, and then you stepped out into the cold fog of a San Francisco night. The temperature drop hit you first, then the darkness, the silence, the empty streets. You walked home alone, the sounds and smells of the bathhouse still clinging to you, the memory of connection already fading. Some men felt exhilarated after a bathhouse visit. They had gotten what they came for: sex, companionship, validation, proof that they were desirable. They walked home with a lightness in their step, already planning when they would return. Other men felt hollow. They had been surrounded by people and still felt lonely. They had touched and been touched and still felt disconnected. The bathhouse had promised something it could not deliver, and the walk home was a confrontation with that failure. The post-bathhouse mood was unpredictable. You could have the exact same experience, same bathhouse, same amount of time, same number of encounters, and feel completely different about it, depending on your state of mind, your expectations, the unknowable chemistry of the night. The regulars learned not to expect too much. They treated the bathhouse as routine, a weekly ritual that sometimes delivered and sometimes did not. The disappointment was less acute when you knew you would be back next week. The first-timers and the occasional visitors had higher stakes. They invested more hope, which meant they experienced more disappointment when the night did not meet expectations. They also experienced higher highs when it did. The question of what exactly people were looking for in the bathhouse was harder to answer than it seemed. Sex, obviously. But sex in service of what? Connection? Validation? Pleasure? Escape? All of the above? The answer varied by person and by night. Some men were explicit about their goals. They wanted to have sex with as many partners as possible in the shortest amount of time. They treated the bathhouse like a competitive sport, keeping mental tallies, comparing notes with friends. For them, the bathhouse was about abundance, variety, the sheer volume of possibility. Other men wanted quality over quantity. They were looking for one good connection, one person they clicked with, one encounter that felt mutual and present. These men circulated slowly, evaluated carefully, rejected frequently. They were willing to spend the entire night searching for the right person. Still, other men were not really looking for anything specific. They came to the bathhouse because it was where gay men went, because it was something to do on a Saturday night, because being alone in the bathhouse felt less lonely than being alone in an apartment. The motivations were as varied as the men themselves, and they were rarely simple. You could want sex and validation and connection and escape all at once. The bathhouse accommodated all of these desires, or tried to, but it could not always deliver. The fantasy element of the bathhouse was significant. The dim lighting, the anonymity, the theatrical architecture, all of it encouraged fantasy. You could project onto the men you encountered, imagine them as whoever you wanted them to be. You could perform a version of yourself, try on different personas, see what worked. Some men cultivated a bathhouse persona that was different from their everyday self. More confident, more aggressive, more overtly sexual. The bathhouse gave them permission to be someone they could not be at work or with family, or even in the gay bars, where verbal communication and social skills mattered more. The silent men thrived in the bathhouse. Men who were shy or awkward in social situations could navigate the bathhouse successfully, because so much communication happened non-verbally. A glance, a touch, a nod, these were easier than conversation for some men. But the silence also created problems. Without verbal communication, consent became murkier. You had to read body language, which was not always clear. Misunderstandings happened. Men who thought they had signaled interest discovered the other person had interpreted their signals differently. Men who thought they had clearly declined found someone persisting anyway. The bathhouse culture developed informal norms to manage this. A hand placed on a shoulder was interest. A hand gently removed was declined. If you approached someone and they turned away or moved to a different part of the room, you did not follow. These rules were not written down. They were learned through observation and experience. New visitors sometimes violated the norms out of ignorance. They followed when they should not have followed. They persisted when they should have backed off. Usually someone, a staff member, or a more experienced patron, would quietly explain the rules. Most people adjusted. A few did not, and they earned reputations as people to avoid. The worst violations, aggression, refusal to accept no, behavior that crossed the line into assault, were rare but not unheard of. The bathhouse staff tried to police this, banning problem patrons, but enforcement was inconsistent. The victim often left without reporting what happened, and without a complaint, the staff had limited ability to act. The safety of the bathhouse was relative. It was safer than cruising in a park at night, safer than going home with a stranger you met in a bar, but it was not perfectly safe. Theft happened. Men left valuables in lockers that were picked. Assault happened, usually in the darker, more isolated sections of the bathhouse where no one was watching. The trade-off was understood. The bathhouse offered freedom and access, but you accepted some level of risk. You kept your money and ID hidden. You stayed in the more populated areas if you wanted safety, ventured into the dark corners only if you were willing to accept what might happen there. The dark corners were their own ecosystem. The back room, the maze, the unlit hallways where men gathered for group encounters or more extreme activities. The dark corners were where the bathhouse shed its last pretense of respectability. No names, no faces, no conversation. Just bodies in darkness, sensation without context. Some men never ventured into the dark corners. They stayed in the lounge, the steam room, the private rooms, spaces that maintained at least a minimal social structure. The dark corners felt too anonymous, too impersonal, too far outside the boundaries of what they were comfortable with. Other men went straight to the dark corners. That was what they came for. The total anonymity, the freedom from even the minimal social negotiation required elsewhere. In the dark corners, you could be no one. You could disappear into pure physicality. The dark corners were also where the most taboo activities happened. Activities that would have been rejected or judged in the more visible parts of the bathhouse. The darkness was permission, a space where the normal rules did not apply. The staff rarely patrolled the dark corners. There was an implicit understanding that what happened in those spaces was beyond management, beyond regulation. As long as no one complained, as long as the activity stayed contained in the designated areas, the staff looked the other way. The group rooms existed in some of the larger bathhouses, spaces explicitly designed for multiple people to gather, designed for communal rather than paired encounters. These rooms had mattresses on the floor, no doors, no privacy. They were open stages where performance and participation blurred together. Not every bathhouse had group rooms. The club baths had one. The Sutro baths had several, tucked into the labyrinth of corridors. The smaller bathhouses could not accommodate the space. But in the establishments that did offer them, the group rooms were always occupied, always active, a center of gravity that drew men throughout the night. The etiquette of the group room was learned, not taught. You could enter and watch, standing along the walls, or you could participate immediately. Watching was acceptable, common even. The watchers formed an audience that added to the theatrical energy. Some men came to the bathhouse primarily to watch. Voyeurism was its own valid participation. The boundaries around touching in the group rooms were fluid. If you were in the room, there was an assumption you were available, but explicit rejection was still respected. A hand placed on you that you did not want. You moved it away, moved yourself away, and that was understood as no. The group dynamic created anonymity even in the presence of others. You were not an individual with a name and history. You were a body among bodies. part of a collective experience that no single person controlled. The group room was the most radical expression of the bathhouse philosophy, sex as communal, democratic, liberated from the constraints of relationship and identity. For some men, the group room was overwhelming, too much sensation and too many people and too little control. They avoided it. For others, it was the entire point, the reason they came, the only place where they felt truly free. The group rooms were also where the most cross-demographic mixing happened. The hierarchies that structured the rest of the bathhouse, age, race, body type, mattered less in the collective chaos of the group room. In the darkness and the tangle of bodies, you could not always see who you were touching or who was touching you. The anonymity leveled the playing field. This was both liberating and troubling. Liberating because it meant men who were usually excluded could participate fully. Troubling because it meant consent became even harder to track, even more reliant on nonverbal communication that could be misread. The philosophical debates about the bathhouse often centered on questions of liberation versus objectification. Were the bathhouses spaces of genuine freedom, or were they replicating the commodification of bodies that defined capitalist society? Were they building community, or were they reducing human connection to transaction? The gay liberationists of the early 70s argued for the former. Bathhouses were radical spaces, they said, where gay men could reclaim their sexuality from a society that had pathologized it. The act of having sex openly, without shame, in a space designed for that purpose, that was resistance. That was political. The critics, often lesbian feminists and a small minority of gay men influenced by feminist thought, argued for the latter. The bathhouses might feel liberating, they said, but they were actually reinforcing the same hierarchies that oppressed gay people in the first place. Beauty standards, youth worship, the reduction of people to body parts, these were not liberation. They were oppression in a different costume. Both analyses contained truth. The bathhouse was a space of contradiction, like all human spaces. It could be liberating and oppressive simultaneously. It could empower and objectify the same person in the same night. The men who went to the bathhouses rarely engaged with these theoretical debates. They were living their lives, seeking connection and pleasure, trying to survive in a world that offered them limited options. The bathhouse was not perfect, but it was available. It was something. The language used to describe bathhouse experiences evolved throughout the decade. In the early 70s, men spoke about the baths with excitement, discovery, the thrill of something new. By the late 70s, the language had become more routine, more matter of fact. Going to the baths was no longer an adventure. It was what you did on Saturday night, like going to the movies or meeting friends for dinner. This normalization was, in its own way, a victory. The bathhouse had become part of the fabric of gay life, so integrated into the community that it no longer needed to be justified or explained. You went to the baths. Everyone understood what that meant, but normalization also brought complacency. The early excitement had given way to routine, and routine could be numbing. Some men found themselves going to the bathhouse not because they wanted to, but because they could not think of anything else to do. The bathhouse had become a habit, and habits could be hard to break. The question of addiction came up occasionally in the gay press. Were some men addicted to the bathhouse, using sex compulsively to avoid dealing with deeper issues? The language of addiction was controversial. It echoed the psychiatric establishment's old claims that homosexuality itself was a compulsion, a disorder. But the question was real. Some men went to the bathhouse every night, spending hours there, structuring their entire lives around the ritual. The gay therapists who worked in San Francisco in the late 70s, and there were several, part of a growing network of mental health professionals who specialized in working with LGBTQ clients, saw clients who struggled with this question. Was frequent bathhouse attendance a sign of healthy sexual expression, or was it avoidance, compulsion, a way of not dealing with loneliness or trauma or internalized shame? The answer depended on the individual. For some men, frequent bathhouse visits were genuinely fulfilling, part of a balanced life that also included work, friendships, hobbies, community involvement. For others, the bathhouse was a way to avoid intimacy, to substitute physical connection for emotional connection, to stay in motion so they never had to be still with themselves. The therapist tried to help clients distinguish between the two. They asked questions. How do you feel after you leave the bathhouse? Do you feel satisfied or empty? Are you going because you want to or because you feel compelled? Do you have relationships outside the bathhouse? Or is the bathhouse your only source of connection? There were no easy answers. The bathhouse was many things to many people, and what it meant to one man was not what it meant to another. The tourist element of bathhouse culture was significant by the mid-1970s. San Francisco had become a pilgrimage site for gay men across America and beyond. Men saved money for months to visit the city, and the bathhouses were part of the itinerary, along with the Castro bars, the Pride Parade, the bookstores, and community centers. The tourists brought energy and money into the bathhouses. They also brought inexperience, which sometimes created friction with the regulars. The tourists did not know the unspoken rules. They were too loud, too eager, too obvious in their excitement. The regulars rolled their eyes, tolerated the tourists with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. But the tourists also reminded the regulars of what the bathhouses meant to the broader community. For someone visiting from a small town in the Midwest, where being openly gay could get you killed, the San Francisco bathhouses were a revelation. They were proof that a different world was possible, that gay men could gather openly and safely and joyfully. The staff at the bathhouses could usually identify tourists immediately. They were the men who asked too many questions at the front desk, who looked overwhelmed when handed their towel, who hesitated before stepping into the lounge. Harold at the 21st Street Baths made a point of being extra welcoming to first-timers. He could see the nervousness, the fear mixed with anticipation, and he wanted them to know they were safe. You could always tell the first-timers, Harold said in his oral history. They held their towel too tight. They looked around like they expected someone to kick them out. I would say, "You are welcome here. Take your time. No one is going to judge you." And you could see them relax, just a little. That was part of the job, making people feel like they belonged. The sense of belonging was what the bathhouses offered that even the gay bars could not quite replicate. In a bar, you still had to perform socially. You had to talk, make small talk, navigate conversation. In the bathhouse, you could belong simply by being present. You did not have to say the right thing or be charming or interesting. You just had to be there, in your body, among other bodies. This was particularly important for men who were shy, introverted, socially awkward. The bathhouse was a space where their usual disadvantages did not apply. The emphasis on nonverbal communication, on physical presence rather than verbal skill, meant they could participate fully in a way they could not in other social settings. The downside was that the skills you developed in the bathhouse did not always translate outside it. You could become fluent in the language of glances and touches, and still be unable to hold a conversation on a date. Some men became so comfortable in the bathhouse environment that they struggled in contexts where verbal communication was required. The bar versus bathhouse debate was a recurring conversation in the gay community. Which was better? Which was healthier? Which built more authentic community? The bar advocates argued that bars allowed for conversation, for getting to know someone before sex, for the possibility of relationships that extended beyond the physical. Bars had names, faces, voices. Bars were social in the fullest sense. The bathhouse advocates argued that bars were just as superficial, just as focused on physical appearance, but with the added burden of having to perform verbally. At least, the bathhouse was honest about what it was. At least you did not have to pretend you were there for the conversation. In practice, most men went to both. The bar for the social experience, for the possibility of meeting someone you might actually date. The bathhouse for the certainty of sexual access, for the efficiency of finding what you were looking for without the preamble. The two spaces served different needs, and the healthiest approach was probably to use both, to recognize that human connection required multiple modalities, verbal and nonverbal, social and sexual, public and private. The travel guides for gay San Francisco always listed both the bars and the bathhouses, understanding that visitors would want access to both. The guides were careful to describe the differences, to help readers choose based on what they were looking for on any given night. Bob Dameron's guide, in its 1977 edition, described the club baths as upscale, good for all ages, busy weekends. It described the Sutro baths as scenic location, labyrinthine layout, younger crowd. It described Ritch Street as industrial, intense, not for first-timers. These brief descriptions communicated volumes to readers who understood the codes. The codes were necessary because the guides were sold in mainstream bookstores, not just gay shops. The language had to be oblique enough that a straight person flipping through would not immediately understand what was being described, but clear enough that a gay reader knew exactly what each entry meant. The existence of these guides was itself a form of liberation. 10 years earlier, there was no printed directory of gay spaces. You learned where to go through whispered recommendations, through the underground network. By the mid-70s, you could buy a book that listed every gay space in North America, with addresses and phone numbers and descriptions. You could plan a trip, navigate a strange city, find community wherever you went. The guides were updated annually, tracking the opening and closing of businesses, the shifts in neighborhood demographics, the evolution of gay geography. The 1975 guide listed 12 bathhouses in San Francisco. The 1978 guide listed 16. The expansion was a direct result of demand. The gay population was growing, and the bathhouses were growing to meet it. But the expansion also meant more competition. Bathhouses had to differentiate themselves, offer something unique to attract customers. Some invested in better facilities, nicer saunas, bigger pools, more comfortable lounges. Others competed on price, offering discount nights or membership deals. Still others cultivated a specific clientele: leather nights, bear nights, under 30 nights. The specialization was a double-edged sword. It allowed men to find exactly what they were looking for, but it also fragmented the community. Instead of one large, diverse space, you had multiple smaller spaces, each catering to a narrow demographic. The sense of a unified gay community began to fray, replaced by subcultures that sometimes barely interacted with each other. The leather community was particularly distinct. By the late 70s, leather bars like the Stud and the Ambush were central to a whole subculture with its own aesthetics, its own sexual practices, its own social norms. The leather community overlapped with bathhouse culture, but was not identical to it. Leather men went to the bathhouses, but they also had their own spaces, their own networks. The South of Market neighborhood, Soma, became the center of leather culture. The bathhouses in Soma, like the Slot on Folsom Street, catered explicitly to leather men and men interested in more intense or kinky sexual practices. The Soma bathhouses were darker, grittier, less concerned with comfort or aesthetics. They were functional spaces for men who knew exactly what they wanted. The divide between the Castro bathhouses and the Soma bathhouses was partly geographic, partly demographic, partly ideological. The Castro was the public face of gay San Francisco. Clean, friendly, accessible. Soma was the shadow, the place where the desires that did not fit the mainstream image could be explored. This divide mirrored larger tensions within the gay community about visibility and respectability. The Castro wanted to be seen, wanted to prove that gay men were normal, non-threatening, deserving of equal rights. Soma was less interested in respectability, more interested in authenticity, in exploring the full range of queer desire without apology. Both approaches had value, both were necessary. The community was large enough to contain multitudes, contradictions, competing visions of liberation. The AIDS crisis, when it arrived in the early 1980s, would force these tensions into the open. But in 1978, in 1979, the future still felt open, expansive. The bathhouses were thriving, the community was growing, the sense of possibility outweighed the sense of threat. The music in the late 70s bathhouses shifted slightly as disco began to splinter into subgenres. The high-energy, orchestral disco of the mid-70s gave way to more electronic sounds, early synthpop, the beginnings of what would become dance music. The bathhouse DJs were among the first to pick up on these trends, playing imports from Europe, tracks that had not yet hit American radio. The music was always a little ahead of the mainstream, because the bathhouse DJs were connected to underground networks, to record stores that specialized in imports, to other DJs in New York and Los Angeles and Amsterdam. The bathhouse was where you heard new music before anyone else, where trends started before they became trends. The best DJs understood that they were not just playing music, they were shaping the emotional arc of the night. The music told you when to be energized, when to relax, when to be playful, when to be serious. A good DJ could manipulate the mood of the entire bathhouse, could create peaks and valleys of energy that kept people engaged for hours. Some DJs became minor celebrities. Men came to the bathhouse on specific nights because they knew who was DJing. The DJ booth, usually tucked into a corner or a small room, became a site of pilgrimage. Men would stop by to request songs, to compliment the DJ, to establish a connection with the person controlling the soundtrack of their experience. The relationship between music and sexuality in the bathhouse was direct and powerful. The right song could heighten arousal, could create a sense of urgency or abandon. The wrong song could kill the mood entirely. DJs learned through experience which tracks worked and which did not, building playlists that kept the energy moving without overwhelming the space. Silence was never an option. Even in the quietest corners of the bathhouse, you could hear the music, muted but present. Silence would have been too confronting, too exposing. The music was a cushion, a layer of sound that gave cover to the other sounds, the breathing, the movement, the small noises of pleasure and effort. The physical toll of the bathhouse experience was rarely discussed but always present. After hours in the heat, sauna, steam room, the general warmth of the building, your body was wrung out, dehydrated despite the juice, exhausted despite the adrenaline. Your muscles ached in ways that felt both earned and unearned. You had been moving, circulating, but you had also been tense, holding yourself in a state of readiness for hours. The sleep that followed a bathhouse night was heavy, deep, the kind of sleep where you woke disoriented, unsure for a moment where you were or what day it was. Your sheets smelled like eucalyptus and chlorine, chemicals that clung to your skin even after showering. Your hair was still damp. Your body remembered everything even as your conscious mind began to blur the details. Some men slept better after the bathhouse than any other time. The physical release, the exhaustion, the temporary quieting of desire, all of it combined to produce a sleep that felt like relief. Other men slept worse, their minds churning through the interactions of the night, replaying rejections or missed opportunities, unable to let go. The morning after was its own ritual. You woke late, body heavy, and moved slowly through the day. Sunlight felt too bright. Noise felt too loud. You existed in a haze, half in the world of the bathhouse and half in the daylight world, not quite belonging to either. By Sunday evening, the fog lifted. You were back to yourself, more or less. The bathhouse receded into memory, something that happened but no longer felt immediate. And already you were thinking about next weekend, about when you might go back. The cyclical nature of bathhouse attendance, weekly for many men, sometimes more often, created a rhythm that structured time. The week was something to get through until Saturday night. Work, errands, obligations. All of it was preamble to the main event. The bathhouse was the reward for enduring the rest of life. This was sustainable for some men. They had jobs, friendships, hobbies, a full life that happened to include regular bathhouse visits. For others, the bathhouse became the only thing that felt real. Everything else was just marking time. The men who fell into the latter category often did not realize it until much later. They woke up one day and realized they had been going to the bathhouse 3, 4, 5 times a week for months. They realized they had stopped making plans with friends because the plans might conflict with bathhouse time. They realized they were spending money they did not have on entry fees, that they were calling in sick to work so they could stay at the bathhouse until dawn. The gay community did not have good language for this pattern yet. Addiction frameworks felt wrong, pathologizing, too close to the old ideas that homosexuality itself was compulsive. But clearly, something was happening that went beyond healthy sexual expression. The therapists tried to help. They talked about using sex to avoid feelings, about the difference between pleasure and numbing, about the importance of emotional intimacy alongside physical connection. Some clients heard this and made changes. Others resisted, arguing that they were fine, that the therapist was being sex negative, that there was nothing wrong with wanting sex frequently. And maybe they were right. Maybe the therapist was imposing norms that did not apply. The bathhouse was a new kind of space, and maybe it required new frameworks for understanding healthy behavior. Maybe going to the bathhouse every night was fine as long as it was not causing harm. The harm was sometimes hard to see. It was not physical, at least not in the 70s before HIV. It was emotional, relational, existential. It was the slow erosion of the capacity for intimacy, the gradual numbing that came from treating every encounter as transactional and anonymous. It was the loneliness that paradoxically increased the more sex you had, because the sex was not filling the hole it was supposed to fill. Not every man experienced this. Some men had active bathhouse lives and also had boyfriends, close friends, rich emotional lives. They had figured out how to integrate sexual freedom with emotional connection. But others had not, and they were suffering quietly, surrounded by people and profoundly alone. The community's response to this suffering was inconsistent. Some men reached out, offered support, tried to help friends who seemed to be struggling. Others looked away, uncomfortable with anything that complicated the narrative of liberation and joy. The late 1970s were the last innocent years. The bathhouses were at their peak, attendance high, new establishments opening, the culture fully developed and thriving. The community felt strong, visible, powerful. Harvey Milk's election and his advocacy had given gay San Francisco political legitimacy. The bathhouses were part of that legitimacy, proof that gay men could build institutions, create culture, sustain community. And then everything changed. The first cases of what would later be called AIDS appeared in 1981. By 1982, the connection to the bathhouses was being discussed, debated, argued over with increasing urgency. By 1984, the bathhouses were at the center of a public health crisis and a political firestorm. But in 1978, in 1979, no one knew. The men who walked through those unmarked doors believed they were walking into the future. They believed the liberation they were experiencing was permanent, that the trajectory was always upward, that the worst was behind them. They were wrong, but they were not wrong to hope. The legacy of the bathhouses is complicated, layered, impossible to summarize neatly. They were spaces of joy and spaces of loneliness. They were radical acts of resistance, and they were sites of exclusion. They were where community was built and where community fractured. For the men who survived the AIDS crisis, and so many did not survive, the memory of the bathhouses carries both pleasure and grief. Pleasure for what they represented, for the freedom they offered, for the proof that gay men could create spaces of their own. Grief for what was lost when the bathhouses closed or transformed, when the crisis turned places of pleasure into symbols of death. The bathhouses that survived the 1980s were never the same. They reopened with new rules, new restrictions, mandatory safe sex policies, health department monitors. The spontaneity was gone. The innocence, if innocence is the right word, was gone. The bathhouses became places where you went to prove you were not afraid, to reclaim something that had been taken, but they never regained the centrality they had in the 70s. The generation that came of age after the crisis had a different relationship to bathhouse culture. For them, the bathhouses were historical artifacts, relics of an era they had missed. They heard stories from older men, read accounts in books and articles, tried to imagine what it must have been like. But imagination could not bridge the gap. You had to have been there. The oral histories collected by Alan Berube and others became more precious as the years passed, and the men who remembered started dying. Berube himself died in 2007, his archive donated to the San Francisco Public Library. The recordings sit there now, dozens of hours of interviews with men who talked about the bathhouses with love and ambivalence and nostalgia and pain. One interview, conducted in 1989, featured a man named Richard, who had been a regular at the club baths throughout the 70s. Richard was HIV positive at the time of the interview, sick but not yet dying. He talked about the bathhouses with a clarity that comes from knowing time is short. "People ask me if I regret it," Richard said. "If I regret going to the baths, having all that sex, living the life I lived." And I say no. Never. Not for 1 second. Yes, I got infected. Yes, I am probably going to die sooner than I would have otherwise, but I lived. I lived fully, openly, without apology. I experienced joy. I experienced connection. I was part of something larger than myself. How many people can say that? How many people live their whole lives and never feel what I felt on an ordinary Saturday night at the baths? Richard died in 1991. He was 38 years old. The AIDS memorial quilt, when it was displayed in full, included panels for thousands of men who had frequented the bathhouses. The panels rarely mentioned the bathhouses specifically. That was not the kind of detail families included. But the men who made the panels, the friends and lovers and chosen family, they knew. They remembered. They sewed the panels with those memories stitched into the fabric. The bathhouse was never just about sex. It was about the right to gather, the right to be visible to each other, the right to build spaces where gay men made the rules instead of straight society. It was about autonomy, self-determination, the insistence that gay lives mattered and gay desires were valid. The panic that surrounded the bathhouses during the AIDS crisis, the calls to close them, the framing of them as vectors of disease, was not just about public health. It was about control. It was straight society trying to reassert authority over gay bodies, gay spaces, gay lives. The bathhouse closures of the mid-1980s were both necessary public health interventions and political defeats. The men who fought to keep the bathhouses open were not being reckless. They understood the stakes. They knew men were dying. But they also knew that the bathhouses represented something essential, something that could not easily be recreated once it was lost. They were fighting for more than buildings. They were fighting for the principle that gay men had the right to decide for themselves what risks to take with their own bodies. In the end, most of the bathhouses closed. Some reopened with restrictions. A few survived essentially unchanged, grandfathered into new regulations, or operating in jurisdictions with more lenient policies. But the culture died. The critical mass of participation that had sustained the bathhouses in the 70s never returned. By the 1990s, the bathhouse was a historical phenomenon, something that belonged to the past. The internet would eventually create new spaces for gay men to connect, new geographies that were virtual rather than physical. The apps that came later, Grindr, Scruff, all the others, replicated some of the bathhouse's functions. Anonymous, efficient, organized around physical proximity and immediate availability. But the apps could never replicate the embodied experience of the bathhouse, the warmth, the smell, the presence of other bodies in space, the risk and vulnerability of being physically present, visible, touchable. The apps were safer, more convenient, more private. But they were not the same. The men who remember the bathhouses talk about them now with a wistfulness that younger generations sometimes find hard to understand. It sounds like nostalgia for promiscuity, for unsafe sex, for a time before people knew better. But that is not quite it. What they are nostalgic for is possibility. For a moment, when the future felt open, and the past felt conquered, and the present felt electric with liberation, they are nostalgic for walking into a space and knowing, immediately and viscerally, that they were not alone, that there were hundreds, thousands of other men who wanted what they wanted, who understood what they understood, who had made the same journey from shame to visibility. They are nostalgic for Saturday nights that stretched into Sunday mornings, for steam rooms where you could barely see but could feel everything, for chance encounters that turned into friendships, for the democratic possibility of desire in a space where everyone started equal, or at least wore the same white towel. The bathhouse taught lessons that the classroom never could. It taught you to read bodies, to communicate without words, to negotiate desire and rejection in real time. It taught you that sex could be joyful, playful, uncomplicated, or it could be fraught, disappointing, isolating. It taught you that liberation was not a state you achieved once and kept forever, but something you had to practice, negotiate, fight for every single day. It taught you that community was built in unlikely places, that chosen family could form in a lounge at 3 a.m., that love was not the only valid form of human connection. And it taught you that freedom was always conditional, always fragile, always at risk of being taken away. The bathhouses of 1970s San Francisco were never utopia. They were human spaces, full of contradiction and complexity, joy and pain, liberation and loneliness. They were exactly what the men who used them needed them to be, imperfect refuges in an imperfect world. But they were also more than that. They were proof that gay men could create institutions, build culture, sustain community. Proof that spaces of queer intimacy could exist openly, could thrive, could become part of the fabric of a city. Proof that the world could change, that what seemed impossible one decade could become ordinary the next. The bathhouses are gone now, most of them. The buildings have been repurposed, condos, gyms, offices, empty lots. The Castro has changed, gentrified, transformed by tech money and rising rents and the inevitable march of time. The community that built the bathhouses has been decimated by AIDS and dispersed by economics and fractured by the same forces that fracture all communities eventually. But the memory remains, in the oral histories, in the archives, in the stories older men tell younger men when they want to explain what it was like before, what was lost, what should be remembered. The bathhouses were where thousands of men learned they were not alone, where they learned their desires were not shameful, where they learned that community could be built from the most unlikely materials, steam and darkness and towels and touch. That lesson matters. It mattered then. It matters now. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your own bed, in your own time, spare a thought for the men who walk through those unmarked doors. The men who paid $5 for a towel and a key and a few hours of freedom. The men who built community in the spaces straight society refused to see. The men who loved each other in rooms where love was supposed to be impossible. They were ordinary men. They worked day jobs, paid rent, navigated family relationships, dealt with heartbreak and loneliness, and the thousand small indignities of being human. But on Saturday nights, in the bathhouses of 1970s San Francisco, they were also extraordinary. They were pioneers, whether they knew it or not. They were building the world we live in now, one encounter at a time. If this story stayed with you, the like button helps the channel reach others who would love it too. May your dreams be free of judgment, free of shame, free of the need to hide who you are from anyone. May you wake tomorrow in a world that the men in the bathhouses fought to create. Imperfect, still unfinished, but better than what came before. Good night, and sleep well.